The Galactic Council Chamber had been standing for over 400 years. In that time, it had hosted some of the most significant moments in recorded galactic history. Treaties that ended wars lasting centuries. Declarations that reshaped borders across dozens of star systems. Emergency sessions where species had stood up and begged for help and sometimes received it and sometimes did not. The chamber had seen grief and anger and relief and the particular heavy silence that falls over a room when everyone present understands that something permanent is about to happen. It had seen a lot. That was the point. 400 years of everything the galaxy could produce, and the chamber was still standing, and the council still met, and somehow the whole complicated arrangement kept functioning. The delegates who filed in that morning had no particular reason to expect anything different from the usual. There were agenda items. There were scheduled speakers. There was the normal low-level tension of a room containing representatives from 47 different species who did not always agree on things. Standard session. Standard morning. Then the crawl walked in, and the room changed. It was not one specific thing they did. It was everything together. The way they moved, the way they positioned themselves, the way their eyes traveled across the assembled delegates with a calm, unhurried assessment of something that was deciding where things stood rather than asking. They were tall, broader than most species present, encased in armor that looked like it had been grown rather than manufactured, dark and dense and shaped to make them look even larger than they already were. There were 12 of them, arranged in a formation that was clearly deliberate, not the scattered, conversational entry of a delegation arriving for a meeting, but the organized advance of something that had thought carefully about how it wanted to be perceived. Their leader came in last. Commander Drax was larger than the others. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have seemed exaggerated, but enough that the difference registered immediately. He walked to the center of the chamber floor and stopped, and he did not move toward the delegation seating area, and he did not look for his assigned position, and he did not make any of the small social adjustments that every other species made when entering a shared space, the slight accommodation, the minor positioning that acknowledged other people were in the room and had an equal right to be there. He stood in the middle of the floor and looked around at everyone with the expression of a person surveying something that belongs to them. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then one of the council moderators, a small and experienced official who had been running sessions for 30 years and had seen most things, leaned toward his microphone and said carefully, "Commander Drax, your delegation's seating area is—" "I am aware of where it is," Drax said. His voice was deep and carried easily without effort, the voice of something built for projection. "I will stand." The moderator sat back. There was a brief silence. Nobody pushed the point. Drax let the quiet sit for a few seconds longer than was comfortable. Then he spoke. The announcement was short. That was the first thing that struck the chamber, not its content but its brevity. When species came to the council with demands, they usually wrapped them in language. Diplomatic framing, historical context, appeals to shared interest. Even the most aggressive declarations usually came dressed in enough words to give everyone present the courtesy of the performance. Drax used no such courtesy. The Crawl, he said, were declaring themselves the alpha species of the galaxy, the natural dominant form, the rightful ruling force over all intelligent life. Any civilization present in this chamber, and any civilization not present, had 30 standard days to formally submit to Crawl authority. Those who submitted would be treated as subjects. Those who did not would receive a visit from the Crawl fleet and would be given one final opportunity to submit in person. He did not describe what happened after that final opportunity. He did not need to. The chamber erupted. Not all at once. There was about 2 seconds of complete frozen silence first, the kind that happens when a room full of people all processes the same information simultaneously, and none of them are sure yet what the correct response is. Then it broke, and it broke loudly. Delegates from a dozen species all trying to speak at once, voices overlapping in multiple languages, the translation system struggling to keep up with the volume and the chaos. Some species were on their feet. Some were speaking directly to each other rather than through the official channels. The moderator was trying to restore order with the strained patience of a man who had prepared for a difficult session, but not for this particular kind of difficult. Through all of it, Drax stood exactly where he had been standing and watched with no visible reaction. Patient. Unbothered. The way something is unbothered when the response of the room is not a factor it has chosen to care about. In the back of the chamber, in the section assigned to smaller and newer delegations, a hand went up. It was not raised urgently, not waved for attention, just raised steadily, the way a person raises a hand when they have a question and are confident they will be called on eventually. Ambassador Jack Reed was sitting in the third row of the human delegation section. He was wearing plain dark clothes with no insignia. He had a coffee in his left hand, a small notepad on the desk in front of him, and the expression of a man who was paying careful attention without being particularly alarmed by what he was paying attention to. The moderator, desperate for something manageable to address in the middle of the chaos, called on him almost by reflex. 30 days from today? Jack asked. His voice was even, conversational. No edge to it, no challenge, just a man confirming a detail. The chamber quieted slightly just from the contrast of his tone against the noise. Drax turned and looked at him. The look lasted a second longer than a simple acknowledgement would have required. "That is correct, human," he said. Jack nodded once, wrote something on his notepad. Then he settled back in his chair and picked up his coffee and stopped talking, in the manner of someone who had gotten the information they needed and was done with the exchange. The chamber stayed a little quieter than it had been for just a moment. Nobody could have explained clearly why that brief exchange felt different from everything that had come before it. Drax had just told 47 civilizations they had 30 days to surrender, and the room had erupted. Jack Reed had asked one clarifying question and sat down, and somehow that had landed in the room with more weight than the eruption. Several delegates glanced at the human section with expressions that mixed curiosity with something that was not quite concern, but was close to it. Jack finished his coffee and did not look up. The crawl did not waste time. That was one thing you could say about them honestly. They were efficient. Within 4 days of the council announcement, 3 separate species that had been vocal in their protests found crawl warships in their home system orbits. Not attacking, just present. Sitting in the darkness above their planets the way a very large and very calm thing sits when it wants you to understand something without having to explain it. All 3 species submitted within 48 hours. The galaxy watched this happen through the various news networks and diplomatic feeds that covered council business, and the galaxy drew the conclusion that the crawl had intended it to draw. This was not a species making empty statements. This was a species that said things and then immediately did those things, and the gap between their words and their actions was small enough that you could not fit any reasonable hope inside it. Other species that had been quietly considering whether to protest or organize some kind of coordinated response went through their own private recalculations. The math was not complicated. The crawl had a large fleet, a demonstrated willingness to use it, and 30 days on a clock that was already running. Whatever you thought about the situation, those were the facts inside it, and facts did not care about your feelings. In the corridors and meeting rooms of the council station, delegates from dozens of species had urgent and mostly quiet conversations about what they were going to do. These conversations all had the same shape. Someone would raise the possibility of resistance or collective response, and someone else would point at the 3 species who had submitted, and the conversation would slowly arrive at the conclusion that 30 days was not a lot of time, and the crawl fleet was not a small fleet, and perhaps the most practical thing was to wait and see how things developed. Waiting and seeing how things developed was a very popular position that month. The humans were quiet throughout all of this. That was the thing that started drawing attention, slowly, and then more quickly as the days passed. Most species were quiet in the way that people are quiet when they are frightened and calculating. You could see the activity even when you could not hear it. Emergency government sessions being broadcast back to home worlds. Military advisors being brought in for consultations. Diplomatic channels lighting up with unusual traffic. The specific busy silence of civilizations that were scared and working hard to figure out what to do about it. The humans were quiet in a different way. Jack Reed was spotted in the station corridors on several occasions over the first week, walking at an unhurried pace, stopping to talk with other delegates in the easy, low-key manner of someone who ran into acquaintances and had a few minutes to spare. Carrying coffee, always, in the same plain travel mug he seemed to have with him at all times. He did not look like a man managing a crisis. He looked like a man on a station he was comfortable on, doing the ordinary social maintenance of someone who worked there and liked the people around him. Other delegates noticed this and found it difficult to interpret. A few approached him directly and asked, with varying degrees of directness, what humanity's response to the crawl announcement was going to be. Jack was consistently pleasant and consistently unhelpful. He said things like, "We're working through our options, and these situations always look clearer with a bit of time, and once memorably, I find it helps not to make decisions before you have to." He said all of it in a tone that was so genuinely relaxed that it was hard to tell whether he was being evasive or whether he actually meant it. Most delegates left those conversations more unsettled than before they had them. The Crawl Intelligence Division was monitoring all of this, as they monitored everything. They had operatives on the council station and long-range surveillance assets covering human space, and they filed regular reports to General Vark, who ran their intelligence operation with the disciplined thoroughness of a man who had built his career on knowing things before other people knew them. The report that came in at the end of the first week made Vark read it twice. Then he called the analyst who had written it and asked him to confirm the findings verbally. The analyst confirmed them. The humans appeared to be doing nothing. Not strategically nothing, not the calculated visible inaction of a species that was working hard behind the scenes. Actually nothing, as far as every surveillance asset Vark could determine. Human military frequencies showed normal traffic. No unusual fleet movements had been detected anywhere in human space. The news broadcasts coming from Earth and the various human colony worlds showed ordinary daily life, the kind of content that a civilization produces when it is not in crisis. People going to work, weather reports, local political news about issues that had nothing to do with the crawl announcement, children in schools, sporting events being played and attended and discussed. The human government had released one official statement in response to the crawl declaration. It was 4 sentences long. It said that humanity was aware of the situation, was reviewing its position, and would respond through appropriate channels in due course. It was the diplomatic equivalent of a polite nod, acknowledging that something had been said without committing to anything about what came next. Vark sat with all of this for a while. He had been doing intelligence work for a long time, long enough to have developed a reliable instinct for the difference between a species that was not reacting because it did not understand what was happening and a species that was not reacting for some other reason entirely. The instinct was not a precise instrument. It could not tell him what the other reason was. It could only tell him that the absence of a reaction was itself a kind of data, and that data was currently making him uncomfortable. He filed a request for a deeper intelligence assessment of human military capability. Full review. Every available source. Highest priority. The response came back faster than he expected, which was itself unusual for a high-priority request, which normally took time to process precisely because of the resources required. The response was not a report. It was a single line, stamped across the top of an otherwise empty document. Restricted. High Command Eyes Only. Vark had worked in crawl intelligence for 22 years. He had filed hundreds of requests at various classification levels. He had received restricted responses before. They were not common, but they existed, and they meant that the information in question was sensitive enough to require a higher clearance to access. He had never received a response that was nothing but the restriction stamp. No partial report. No summary cleared for his level. No indication of what the full report contained or how extensive it was. Just the stamp, clean and alone on an empty page, telling him that whatever was on the other side of that clearance level was something his superiors had decided he did not need to see. Vark sat back in his chair and looked at the empty document for a long time. In 22 years, he had developed a second instinct alongside the first one, which was that the things your own organization did not want you to know about were often more important than the things it did. He looked at the stamp. He thought about Jack Reed walking unhurried through station corridors with his coffee and his easy manner and his answers that were pleasant and said nothing. He thought about a civilization doing nothing for reasons that his best surveillance assets could not explain. He thought about the fact that someone at Crawl High Command had already pulled the full intelligence assessment on human military capability and decided it was not for general distribution. He closed the document without filing a follow-up request. Some questions he had learned over a long career had answers that arrived whether you asked for them or not. He decided he would wait for this one to arrive on its own. The 30th day arrived the way significant days usually do, looking exactly like any other day until it didn't. The council station woke up that morning with the specific energy of a place that had been dreading something for a long time and had finally run out of days to dread it with. Delegates moved through the corridors with the tight, careful manner of people who had made their decisions and were now simply waiting to find out how those decisions sat in practice. Most species had filed their formal submissions to Krull authority over the preceding week, some early, some leaving it to the last few days, each one a small and quiet surrender delivered through diplomatic channels and received by the Krull with the brisk efficiency of an organization that had been expecting exactly this outcome. The ones who had not yet submitted were the ones nobody was quite sure about. A handful of smaller species still sitting with their options. And the humans who had sat with their options for 30 days and had not said anything useful to anyone about what those options actually were. The council session was scheduled for mid-morning. It was not officially billed as a Krull session. The formal agenda listed 3 items of routine council business, but nobody present had any illusion about what the morning was actually for. Drax would arrive. He would make whatever announcement he had decided to make. And the chamber would sit through it the way the chamber had been sitting through things for 30 days, with the patient and unhappy resignation of people who had calculated their situation thoroughly and did not like what the calculation produced. Delegates began filing into the chamber about 20 minutes before the session was due to start. Jack Reed came in with them. He looked, as he had looked for the entire 30 days, completely fine. He was wearing the same kind of plain dark clothes he always wore, nothing ceremonial, nothing that marked the day as different from any other. He had his coffee, the travel mug, the same one. At this point, half the station probably knew that mug by sight. He walked to the human delegation section, said good morning to the 2 other human delegates already seated, and sat down with the unhurried ease of someone settling in for a session he expected to follow a reasonable course. A few nearby delegates watched him do this, and then looked at each other. Nobody said anything, but the look that passed between them contained a question that nobody had managed to answer in 30 days of trying. What does he know that the rest of us don't? And why does he keep looking like that? The chamber filled. The moderator took his position. The ambient noise of 47 delegations settling into their seats filled the room with its usual pre-session texture. Then the Krull came in. Drax led them, as he had led them on the first day, with the same formation and the same deliberate pace, and the same quality of occupying space, as if the space had been built for him personally. He moved to his position at the front of the chamber and stopped. Then he looked at his console.
It was a small thing.
A slight shift of attention, the kind of momentary check that people did automatically when they entered a room and had messages waiting. Nobody in the chamber would have noticed it except that Drax stopped moving when he did it, and the Krull behind him adjusted to his stillness with the practiced precision of a military formation that had been trained to match his pace exactly. The chamber noticed the stillness. Drax looked at the console for a moment longer than a routine check required. Then he reached out and opened the message. Nobody in the chamber could see what was on his screen. They could only see his face, and his face was doing something that the delegates who had been watching Krull behavior for 30 days had not seen it do before. Not anger. Not surprise exactly. Something more specific and harder to name. The expression of a very controlled and experienced military commander receiving information that was requiring him to apply that control more than usual. He read it. He was still for a moment. Then he read it again. The chamber was quiet in the way chambers go quiet, when everyone present senses that something is happening without being able to see what it is. What was on Drax's screen was not a protest. Not a diplomatic response. Not any of the things that the various species in the chamber had been filing for 30 days. It was a set of coordinates. And a timestamp. And nothing else except a single line of text at the bottom. The coordinates pointed to a location in Krull space that housed their primary military staging base, the station that had taken 40 years to build, that housed their reserve fleet and their weapons production infrastructure and their central command systems, the single most important military installation the Krull operated, and the foundation on which most of their actual power rested. The timestamp was from 4 hours ago. Drax looked at it the way you look at something when your mind is telling you to check it again, because the first reading cannot be right. He pulled up the surveillance feed for those coordinates. Empty space. Clean, ordinary, unoccupied deep space, the kind of space that had never had anything in it and showed no sign of having recently had anything in it either. The energy residue readings showed something had been there, a faint signature that his science team would later spend considerable time analyzing and be unable to fully identify, but the station was not there. The reserve fleet was not there. The manufacturing infrastructure was not there. Nothing was there. A structure that had taken 40 years to construct and that contained more military capability than most species could produce in a century was simply gone. Not destroyed in the way that weapons destroy things, leaving debris and radiation and the scattered evidence of what used to exist. Just gone the way something is gone when it has been removed rather than broken. The single line of text at the bottom of the message was short. We have been ready for considerably longer than 30 days. Earth Diplomatic Office. Drax stood at his console and read that line, and the chamber watched his stillness and did not fully understand it yet but felt the weight of it pressing against the room like a change in air pressure. In the back of the chamber, Jack Reed picked up his coffee and took a slow sip and set it back down and looked at the front of the room with the same calm and attentive expression he had been wearing for 30 days. He did not look like a man watching a situation develop. He looked like a man watching a situation arrive at the place it had always been going. Around him, one by one, the other delegates began to understand that the morning they had prepared themselves for and the morning they were actually in were two completely different mornings. The chamber stayed very quiet. Nobody asked Drax to take a seat. The attack order came through 18 hours after Drax read the message. 18 hours was actually a long time by Krall standards. Their military decision-making was built for speed, command structures designed to move from order to execution in minutes, not hours. The 18-hour gap told anyone paying attention that there had been a conversation at the highest levels of Krall leadership, and that the conversation had not been simple. Nobody who heard about the attack order later could confirm exactly what was said in that room. What came out the other end of it was a decision that historians would examine from every angle for years afterward, trying to locate the logic inside it and finding only partial answers. The simplest answer, the one that most analysts eventually settled on, was pride. Not irrational pride, or, at least, not pride that felt irrational from inside the Krall framework. The Krall had been a dominant military force for generations. Their entire identity, their culture, their internal social structure, the way their leaders earned and kept authority, all of it was built on a foundation of never backing down. A Krall commander who retreated was not a commander who had made a smart tactical decision. A Krall commander who retreated was a commander who had failed in the most fundamental way their civilization defined failure. Drax had built his entire career on the principle that the Krall moved forward. Always. That was not a strategy. It was closer to a fact about what the Krall were. And beyond pride there was something else, something harder to name, but just as real, the simple difficulty of processing information that did not fit the existing picture. The Krall knew what humanity was. They had intelligence reports. They had assessments. They had a clear and well-documented understanding of a species that had recently achieved basic spaceflight and divided itself into hundreds of arguing political factions, and had not shown any indication of being a serious military concern. That picture had been assembled carefully over time by people who were good at their jobs. One message with a set of coordinates did not erase that picture overnight. The mind does not work that way, even a disciplined military mind. You can receive new information and understand it intellectually, and still find your decisions being shaped by what you believed before you received it.
So they attacked.
The Krall fleet moved into position, and the attack orders went out, and the machinery of a large and experienced military operation began doing what it had been designed to do. For the first few hours, nothing happened. That was the first thing that felt wrong. A Krall military operation of this scale moving into position should have produced a response, some kind of visible reaction from the other side. Defensive fleet movements. Communication traffic on military frequencies. The thousand small signs that a civilization was responding to incoming force. The Krall commanders watched their displays and saw none of it, and the absence of it sat in their command centers with an uncomfortable weight. Then the reports started coming in. The first one was from a fleet element that had moved to secure a human military installation on the edge of the conflict zone. The installation had been documented in Kral intelligence files as a significant defensive structure, well-armed and well-crewed. The fleet element arrived at the coordinates and found nothing. The installation was gone. Not destroyed. The scans showed no debris, no energy discharge residue consistent with an explosion, no sign that anything violent had occurred. Just empty space where something had been. The commander of that fleet element filed the report in the careful, precise language of someone trying to describe something accurately while finding the accurate description very difficult to write. The second report came in 20 minutes later. Different location. Same result. Then a third. Then 4 more within the hour. The Kral military installations that were well documented in their own records began disappearing from their positions. Not Kral installations, human ones. Human military assets that the Kral fleet was moving to engage kept not being where they were supposed to be. And in the cases where the Kral fleet arrived and found something, what they found was not what their intelligence had led them to expect. Human ships appeared without approach signatures, the same way the ship had appeared in the border sector weeks earlier. No transition flash. No energy buildup. No warning on any frequency. One moment, a Kral fleet element was operating in open space, and the next moment there were human vessels present that had not been there a second before, already in position, already doing whatever they had come to do. The engagements were short. That was the word that appeared in Kral after-action reports more than any other, in the cases where there were Kral personnel left to write after-action reports.
Short.
Not because the human ships were fast, though they were. Not because their weapons were overwhelming, though the ones the Kral encountered were far beyond anything the intelligence assessments had suggested. Short because the human operations were precise in a way that the Kral had not encountered before, targeted, specific, surgical. They were not there to fight. They were there to finish. Military station after military station went the way of the staging base. Clean disappearances that left nothing behind but faint energy signatures and the increasingly desperate reports of Kral commanders trying to describe what was happening to a high command that was processing the reports with the stunned focus of people watching something unfold that they had specifically determined could not unfold. Fleet after fleet.
Gone.
Through all 9 days, not a single human casualty was reported. Not through carelessness on the Kral side. Their commanders were trying, with everything they had, to land a hit on something, anything, that would give them a foothold in the engagement. Every attempt produced the same result. The thing they were trying to hit was not where they were trying to hit it by the time the attempt arrived. The Kral High Command held emergency sessions on the 3rd day, and the 5th day, and the 7th day. Each session was shorter than the last because there was progressively less to discuss, and progressively more to simply accept. On the 9th day, a communication went out from Kral High Command on a frequency that had not been used in living Kral memory. The frequency reserved in their oldest military protocols for surrender communications. Jack Reed was at his desk on the council station when it came through. He had a half-finished coffee on the desk beside him and a report open on his screen that had nothing to do with the Kral. He read the surrender communication once, the way you read something when you already know what it says, and are simply confirming the details. Then he set it down and picked up his coffee. He took a slow sip and looked out the small window above his desk at the stars and was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when something long and complicated has finally arrived at its end. Then he opened a fresh document and began drafting his response. The surrender meeting was held 3 days after the final Kral communication. Jack had suggested the council station as the location, neutral ground, the same place where the whole thing had started 39 days ago when Drax had walked into a chamber and told the galaxy how things were going to be. The Kral delegation had agreed without negotiation on the venue, which was itself a small signal about how thoroughly the last 9 days had rearranged things. The council chamber was not used for the meeting. Jack had specifically requested a smaller room, a standard diplomatic conference room on the mid-level of the station, the kind of room used for routine bilateral meetings between delegations. Round table. Reasonable chairs. No elevated positions. No architectural choices designed to make anyone feel small. The Kral delegation arrived first. There were 4 of them, which was a fraction of the 12 that Drax had brought to the original announcement. Drax himself was not among them. The lead negotiator was a quieter figure, Colonel Ted Cross, a name that had come up in human intelligence assessments as one of the Crawl officers who had filed internal objections to the Alpha Declaration before it was made public. Those objections had been overruled, which was why nobody outside the Crawl had known about them, and which was also why Ted Cross had spent the last month watching events unfold with the particular discomfort of someone whose private predictions had come true in the worst possible way. He sat down at the table and folded his hands and waited. Jack came in 2 minutes later with his coffee and one other human delegate, a legal advisor named Ann Perry, who carried a slim folder and had the focused, efficient manner of someone who had prepared a document carefully and was confident in its contents. Jack sat across from Ted, set his coffee on the table, and looked at the Crawl delegation with the same calm and open expression he had been wearing since the first day. No coldness, no triumph, no performance of any kind. He looked like a man who had come to finish a piece of work and wanted to finish it properly. Outside the conference room, in the council chamber, and in every diplomatic lounge and communication center on the station, the rest of the galaxy was watching through whatever feeds they had access to. The formal proceedings were being broadcast on the council's official channel, which meant that every species with a delegation present was tuned in, and those delegations were sending live relays back to their home governments, which meant that the audience for what happened in that small conference room extended across dozens of star systems. They were all expecting the same thing. That was the honest truth of it. Every species watching, regardless of how they felt about humanity or the Crawl or the events of the last 9 days, had come to the broadcast with the same expectation built into them by 10,000 years of galactic history. Victory produced terms. Terms extracted the maximum the victor could justify taking. The defeated party accepted those terms because the alternative was worse, and both sides understood that the terms were designed to ensure the victor stayed on top, and the defeated party stayed reminded of where it now stood. This was not cynicism. It was just pattern recognition. It was what dominant powers did. It was what every dominant power in galactic history had done, without exception, because power that did not consolidate itself was power that eventually got challenged, and no species that had ever won a significant conflict had chosen to leave that calculus unaddressed. And Perry opened her folder and slid a single document across the table to Ted Cross.
Ted looked at it.
He was a careful reader. You could see him working through it, not scanning but actually reading, taking in each line with the attention of someone who understood that documents of this kind contained their meaning in the specific words chosen rather than the general impression they gave. He reached the end. He went back to the beginning and read it again. Then he read it a third time, slower than the first two, and when he finished the third reading he set it flat on the table in front of him and was quiet for a moment. The document was short. That was the first thing. A surrender agreement of this significance, following a conflict of this nature, between a defeated military power and the civilization that had defeated it, should have been long. Should have been pages of detailed provisions and annexes and implementation schedules. The document Anne had prepared fit comfortably on 2 pages, and the second page was mostly signature space. The terms were 3. The Crawl would reduce their military to a level sufficient for planetary defense of their home systems only. Independent verification would be provided by a council-appointed body, and the process would be completed within 18 standard months. The Crawl would make full reparations to the 3 civilizations they had subjugated during their 30-day window, financial, material, and formal diplomatic acknowledgement of what had been done. The terms of those reparations would be set by the 3 affected civilizations themselves, with the Council as mediator. The Crawl would take a seat at the Galactic Council table. A standard seat, standard height, same as every other delegation. Ted read it a third time because he was looking for the rest of it. The provisions that were hidden in the language. The implementation clauses that would translate the simple words into something more extractive once the ink was dry. The long tail of consequences that Victor's agreements always carried, sometimes openly and sometimes buried in the technical language of annexes that nobody read carefully until it was too late. There was no rest of it. He looked up at Jack. "Why?" he asked. It was a genuine question, not a tactical one. The question of a man who had studied enough history to know that what was sitting on the table in front of him did not match any template that history provided. Jack looked at him steadily. "Because the point was never to destroy you," he said. His voice was even and unhurried, the same tone he had used in every conversation for the last 39 days. You made a decision that caused harm, and that decision needed to have consequences. The 3 civilizations you subjugated needed to be made whole. Your military capability needed to come down to a level that matched your actual defensive needs rather than your ambitions. He paused for just a second. That's all the point ever was. Ted waited. There was more he could tell. The Alpha thing, Jack said, and his tone shifted slightly, not harder, just more direct. That was never real. No species is alpha. The galaxy is not a hierarchy with a correct answer at the top of it. It's a collection of civilizations that have to share the same space indefinitely, and the ones that try to put themselves above everyone else always eventually find out the same thing. He picked up his coffee. Being strong is not the same thing as being in charge. The Krall are strong. You always were. That was never the problem. The problem was what you decided that strength meant you were entitled to. He set the coffee down. It doesn't mean that. It never did. Nobody is alpha. The galaxy works better when everyone has a seat at the table, including you. Ted Cross looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked back down at the document. At the 2 clean pages that contained the whole of what humanity was asking for in exchange for 9 days that had dismantled the Krall military infrastructure more thoroughly than anything in Krall history. He picked up the pen that and had placed beside the document.
He signed.
The broadcast feed carried it live to every delegation on the station and through them to dozens of home worlds across the galaxy. The moment the pen came down and the signature was complete, the council chamber, where the majority of the station's delegates had gathered to watch the feed together rather than separately, went through a brief silence. Then someone started clapping. It was a small sound at first. 1 delegate, then 2, then a ripple moving through the chamber the way things move through a room when one person does something true, and everyone else recognizes it. Within a few seconds, it was the whole chamber, every delegation, every species, from the smallest insectoid representatives in the back rows to the oldest and most powerful civilizations in the senior seats. Not a celebration of a military victory. The galaxy had seen plenty of those, and they had a different sound. Louder, more aggressive, the sound of relief mixed with the giddiness of having been on the winning side. This was quieter, more sustained. The sound of people applauding something they had genuinely not expected to see and were not entirely sure they had words for yet. In the conference room, Jack heard it faintly through the walls, the distant, steady sound of the chamber 1 floor above. He did not look up or acknowledge it. He picked up his coffee and finished what was left of it and set the empty mug down and looked across the table at Ted Cross, who was also sitting quietly, also listening to the sound coming through the walls with an expression that was tired and complicated, and somewhere underneath both of those things, very slightly relieved. The galaxy had spent a long time believing that strength and dominance were the same word. It had just watched someone take the time to show it the difference. That was the thing nobody found the right words for that day, the thing that the applause was really for, not a victory, not a display of power, but the specific and rare and quietly remarkable sight of a civilization that had every reason to take everything it wanted and had looked at that option clearly and chosen something better instead.